Hey, good morning. How are we? Hey, happy Father's Day. Great to be with you guys together this morning. My name is Chris Cummings, I'm lead pastor here at Doxa. And if today is your first day with us, man, I just want to say thank you so much for trusting us with your Sunday morning. We do hope and pray this place will feel like home for you very easily. On your way in, you should have received a program that looks like this. On one side is a list of announcements if you want to see just what's coming up in the life of our church. And at the bottom of that section is a little connect card. And if today is your first day with us, we would love the opportunity to connect with you and to help you get connected as well. And one of the best ways for us to do that is for you to fill out that card. Once you fill it out, you can do one of two things with it. You can either put it in the offering baskets when they get passed later on in the service, or you can take it to our connections lobby. That's right when you first walk in. That's where our team will be after the service is over. We just love the opportunity to meet you, introduce ourselves to you, and also give you a gift. Say thank you for joining us today. And so again, just incredibly glad to be here with you all together today. Over the past several weeks, we have been walking through a series in the New Testament book of Hebrews. We've been several weeks into this now. We actually dedicated half of this year to walk through this book. And as we entered into the summer months, we really began to put the brake on this and really slowed down because we entered into what is easily the most popular and the most famous section in this entire book. Hebrews chapter 11, what many people would call the Faith Hall of Fame. And what the author of Hebrews is doing in Hebrews chapter 11 is he is giving us example after example after example of faithful men and women of the Old Testament who faithfully endured to the end. And the reason why he gives us all of these different examples is with the hopes that we would, in a similar way, imitate their faith, and we too would faithfully endure to the end. And so all summer long, we're looking at each one of these little stories, going back to the Old Testament to see for ourselves what it looks like to put our faith in God and faithfully endure. And today, we come to a really remarkable story. We come to the story of Abraham and Isaac. And when it comes to the story of Abraham and Isaac, man, for many of us, it stirs up a lot of feelings, one of which is it can stir up a lot of uncomfortable feelings. And one of the reasons why is because of what God tells Abraham to do, which is to offer up his son, to surrender his son, and to literally sacrifice his son on an altar. What a better way, no better way, to celebrate Father's Day than talking about a moment when a dad almost kills his son, right? But it makes us uncomfortable in that regard, right? But here's the other thing. I think it makes us uncomfortable for another reason, a deeper reason within us. And that other reason is that what this story inevitably does is it begins to poke at our hearts and prick at our loves. It begins to reveal to us the order of our loves and what it is that we truly actually love most. And what it might be that is starting to become the center of our hearts itself. You see, here's the thing. When it comes to Christianity, I think for many of us, when we think about what the greatest threat is to our intimacy with God and our faith with God, for many of us, we think that it's the bad things in our life, right? Like it's the sin in our life and all these things that we do that we know we shouldn't do. And we think to ourselves, if I can just not do the things I'm not supposed to do and get rid of all the bad things, then everything else will be fine. And that's what we tend to think about. But here's the reality. The reality is that one of the greatest threats to your intimacy with God and your faith with God is not the bad things. It's the good things in your life. It's the good things in your life that tempt you to elevate them to a place where God ought to be. You see, the reality is sin in your life, sin is crafty. Sin is insanely deceitful in our lives. And what sin oftentimes does is it tries to take the good things in our lives and tries to make them God things. It tries to take the promises of God and tries to make them preeminent to God. Tries to take the good gifts that God has given us and tries to make us value them more than the goodness of God himself. That's what sin does in our life. It's deceitful. It's crafty in that way. And it tries to put something on the throne of our hearts that's not God in the position as if it were God. That's what sin does in us. And the reality is that every single one of us, we got some things in our lives that we deeply treasure and value and love, and we are dangerously close to letting that thing sit on the throne of our lives and being the center of our affections. Every single one of us has these things. Maybe for some of us, maybe it's our family. It's our kids, maybe it's our spouse. And maybe it's our job or occupation. Maybe it's hopes and dreams. Maybe it's something in the future, and we're thinking to ourselves, if I can only have that thing, then everything will be as it should be. And we all have these little onlys in our lives that are good things, but they're trying to become God things. And if we're not careful, they can easily sit on the throne of our hearts that was only made for God. But the thing about the story of Abraham and Isaac is that God is inviting us to recognize what those things are and surrender them before him. And man, we have a really easy time surrendering the things that we don't want. It's easy for us to say, God, take away my anxiety, take away my worry, take away these sins. But the things that we treasure, things that we love, it's so much more difficult to lay those things down. Yet the story of Abraham and Isaac, what it ultimately does is it brings about two big questions that every single one of us has to answer for ourselves today. And the first question is, what is it that I'm treasuring above God? What is it that I trust more than him? And the second thing is this, that whenever God invites me to lay those things down and surrender them to him, how do I respond? Do I respond in faith or do I respond in fear? Those are the two big questions that we have to ask for ourselves today. And that's what we're going to see through the lens of this story. So if you have a Bible with you, go and open up Genesis chapter 22 is where we're going to be together today, looking at verses 1 through 14. Genesis 22. As you're turning there, if you don't have a Bible with you, don't worry. You have the verses on the screen behind me so that you can easily follow along. And if you don't own like a physical copy of God's word, you can visit our hospitality kiosk or connections lobby before you leave today and grab a free copy for yourself. Genesis chapter 22, we're going to start in verse 1. And as you're turning there, what we've seen from last week to this week really is not a ton. Last week we saw the story of Noah. The story of Noah is Genesis 6 through 9. Shortly after the story of Noah, we see the story of the Tower of Babel, some genealogy after that, and then we meet a guy named Abraham. And God selects Abraham from all other families, not because Abraham's the greatest on the planet or anything like that, just in God's sovereignty and grace, he selects Abraham and makes a massive promise with Abraham. He calls him out of his family to journey to a foreign land and tells him that it's through your family that I will make them into a great nation, and through that nation, all other nations and all other families will be blessed. And what we see in the life of Abraham is we see this constant back and forth between faith and fear. That we see moments where Abraham takes great steps of faith. At the same time, moments where Abraham begins to doubt the promises of God and in fear begins to hold tightly towards these other things and try to control outcomes on his own. And back and forth all throughout the story of Abraham, we see faith and fear going back and forth. And today we see what is easily the greatest test for Abraham. And one of the big questions that we see in light of this is, how will he respond? Is it with faith or is it in fear? So with that in mind, here we go. Verse 1, here's what it says. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Before we dive fully into this story, we got to deal with some things here first. Because whenever we first read about this story, we have some major objections that arise, don't we? You see, what we find is that God gives Abraham a test, and the test is this: to go and offer up his son in the land of Moriah and to sacrifice him as a burnt offering. That's the test. And when it comes to this test, God tells him what to sacrifice, where to sacrifice it, and how to sacrifice it. And when it comes to our objections, we don't typically have an objection with the how. We don't have really an objection with the where, like Moriah of all places. Like, really? We don't have an objection with the where, but we have a massive objection with the what, right? That God is telling him in this moment to offer up his son as a sacrifice. And for many of us, we're like, wait, hold on for a minute, right? And for many of us, where we tend to find a tension in this text is a tension between the command of God for Abraham and the goodness of God. Because these two things seem to be at odds with each other right here. Because we can look at other passages in the Bible where God clearly tells his people not to offer up their sons or their daughters as sacrifices, and yet here he tells Abraham to do that. And so there's this massive tension that we begin to feel here between the command of God and the goodness of God. How can God tell Abraham to do this particular thing? And for many of us, that's where the tension is. But here's the thing. We got to be really careful here because the tension in this story is not predominantly here. The greatest tension in this story is not predominantly between God's command and God's goodness. The great tension of this story is predominantly found between God's command and God's promises. That's where the main tension's found. You see, when it comes to the goodness of God, what we have to remember is that God is sovereign over all things, that he's the sovereign king, and that he is the sovereign judge over all things. The Bible calls him the author of life, which means that God in his sovereignty has full authority to both give and take away life as he pleases. The tension here is not between God's command and God's goodness. Even if God wanted Isaac dead in this moment, which we will see is clearly not what God wants, God would still be just, still sovereign, still be good in the midst of all of it. The tension is not between God's command and God's goodness. The predominant tension is God's command and his promises. Because when it comes to Isaac, there's a lot of promises wrapped up in Isaac. Whenever God first calls Abraham, he calls Abraham and gives him that promise: through your family, all other families and all other nations will be blessed. It's a massive promise. And then Abraham and his wife Sarah wait 25 years before they finally have their first son, who is Isaac. Their first child, 25 years. Abraham's 100 years old when Isaac is born. It's crazy. They wait forever for Isaac to be born. And not only that, but right before this, in the chapter before this, Genesis 21, God speaks to Abraham and tells him clearly, he says, Abraham, it's through Isaac, your son Isaac, which all of your offspring will be named. That's it. And so when it comes to the promise that God makes him, Isaac is really the hinge point in the promise being fulfilled. You don't have Isaac, you don't have a fulfilled promise. So the tension here is really between the command of God to sacrifice Isaac and the promises of God saying that through Isaac, I'm gonna fulfill all the promises that I made you. How can God possibly fulfill his promises to Abraham if Isaac is dead and childless? It's not really gonna work. And that's where we find the greatest tension in this story. But it's in this tension that we also see purpose. There's purpose in the tension. And the purpose that we see in this tension is what the author of Genesis tells us, is that God comes to Abraham to test him. Now, when it comes to tests in our world, typically what tests are meant to do is they are meant to reveal something that is currently unknown, to make something known that is currently unknown. That's the purpose of tests. So the reason why a professor or a teacher will give their students tests is they want to know what their students are learning, what they're retaining, what they're growing in. They want to know something that's unknown. That's the whole purpose. But the reality is that when it comes to God, God knows everything. In fact, the Bible tells us that God sees not the way that we see. God doesn't see just the exterior, he looks at the interior. He knows our heart. He can see the depths of our own soul. He knows what Abraham loves, what he cherishes, what he values. And so for God, he already sees it all. He knows it all. There's nothing unknown to him. Everything's revealed to him. And so what's the purpose of this test if God already knows it? Well, the purpose is not to make something unknown known to God, but rather to make something unknown known to Abraham, to make something known to him, to reveal to him the reality of his own heart and his own soul, and to draw him closer in intimacy with God himself. See, what we find throughout the New Testament is that every single test, every trial, every tribulation that God gives his people always has the purpose of that it is for the good of his people. Every single one of them. That's why all throughout the New Testament, what we find is that every New Testament writer is constantly telling us to rejoice in trials, to count it all joy when we experience trials, because the outcome is that it changes us and it draws us closer to God himself. And oftentimes what God will do in the midst of these tests and in the midst of these trials is that in order to strengthen our faith in God, he will show us what we are putting our faith in that's other than God. He will reveal to us the layers of our loves and the depths of our soul and what it truly is that we have put our faith in and we've placed our hope in. And he'll reveal those things to us to draw us near to him. And that's the purpose of the testing right here. You see, whenever God gives this test to Abraham, I want you to notice how God describes Isaac. He doesn't say, hey, Abraham, go offer up your son Isaac on the altar. The way that he describes Isaac, he says, go offer up Isaac, your son. Then he gets a little bit deeper. He says, your only son. And then even deeper, the son whom you love, the one you cherish, the one that you adore. And whenever God describes Isaac in that way, here's what's fascinating. What's fascinating is that when it comes to Isaac, Isaac is not Abraham's only son. He's got another son. You see, there's a moment in Abraham's life where he's going back and forth between faith and fear, and God makes this promise to him, and there's this moment where all of a sudden he's not seeing the promise play out the way that he thinks it should be played out. And he does what many of us would do, and he begins to take matters into his own hands, and he has this conversation with his wife, Sarah, and they begin to believe that maybe the promise is for Abraham, but not for Sarah. And so they agree, and Sarah tells Abraham, why don't you go have a child with another woman? Maybe the promise is with another person. And he goes and has another son with a woman named Hagar, and that son's name is Ishmael. Isaac's not Abraham's only son. He's got another son. But for Abraham, Isaac is the only son of Sarah. He's the son of the promise. He's the one that God said that he would give him 25 years ago. And because of who Isaac is, because Isaac is the promised one to Abraham, it was as Isaac was his only one. For Abraham, Isaac was his one and only. That he cherished him deeply, loved him deeply. The Canadian pastor and theologian A.W. Tozer once said it like this. He said, Abraham had become the love slave of his son. And what he means by that is that Isaac had become so central in Abraham's affections that Abraham's heart was in serious danger of being mastered by the love he had for his own son. For Abraham, Isaac was his little one and only. And God knew that. And now God is coming to Abraham and saying, Abraham, I want you to offer him up. Surrender him to me. Make this sacrifice. Place him on the altar. The big test for Abraham is this. What do you love most? Do you love the gift that I've given you? The promise that I've fulfilled? Or do you love me? And here is this massive tension moment that we see. The command of God and the promise of God. And the big question that we see in light of this is, how is Abraham going to respond? Is he going to respond in fear yet again? Or is he going to respond in faith? Look at verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Notice that when God gives Abraham this command, go sacrifice your son on the altar, Abraham shows immediate obedience. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't delay. It says that he wakes up early in the morning, prepares everything for the journey ahead. There is no hesitation in him whatsoever. There's no objection that Abraham has. No questions. Which honestly, if you know Abraham's story, really odd, right? Not a single objection in this moment. No questions or qualms whatsoever. What an odd thing. Because here's the thing, there's a moment in Abraham's life where God makes it known to him what he's gonna do to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, two very wicked cities. And as God makes it known to him that he's gonna destroy these two cities, Abraham is very bothered by that and intercedes on behalf of these two cities. He's like, God, really, you're gonna do this? You're gonna destroy two cities? What about the righteous people in these cities? How can you possibly do this? He's got a trillion questions. And yet here, when God says, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son on the altar. Go travel to Moriah, offer him as a burnt offering. Abraham has no questions, no objections. And the reality is there's plenty here, right? Like one objection being like, really, God? Like this, you want me to do this? Like, isn't this against like what you stand for? Like, I thought you were anti-human sacrifices. Like, what's going on? Or what about like, God, how are you gonna fulfill your promise to me if if Isaac is dead? That's another good objection. Or what about the objection of just like his own wife and his family? Like, can you imagine if Abraham went through with all of this, came back home days later without Isaac, and had to face Sarah, and Sarah's like, hey, where's Isaac? He's like, oh, I killed him on a mountain? Like, wow. That would not go well. I can only imagine it would take years of couples counseling for them to finally get back together, right? There's plenty of objections, thousands of questions that Abraham could raise at this moment. He raises none of them. Why? In this moment, Abraham knew that he heard from God, and he knew exactly what God had told him to do. And for Abraham, that was enough. He knew who spoke to him, and he knew what God had to say. And Abraham in this moment doesn't know how God is gonna keep his promise, but he knows that somehow, some way, God is going to be faithful and keep his promise. And because he has that kind of faith, he proceeds forward in what God has called him to go do. Look at verse 4. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. Abraham and Isaac began to journey for 3 days. And every step that Abraham takes, he takes with a step of faith. 3 days of travel, which means that 3 days in any of those moments, he could have easily turned around and gone back. Could have raised other questions and other objections, found a reason to go back home and doesn't. Stays focused on what God has called him to and continues to journey forward. And then finally he gets to a spot where he can see where God has called him to go. He sees the mountain God's calling him to. And notice what he tells the two young men that are with him. He says something really fascinating. He says, me and the boy, me and Isaac, we're gonna go over there and we're gonna worship. And then he says, and we're gonna come again to you. Abraham in this moment knows. He's like, I don't know how God's gonna do it, but somehow, some way, God is gonna keep his promise, and he's convinced that him and Isaac are gonna come back that day. And then after they leave, those two young men, they begin to journey to the mountain. And as they do, Isaac proposes a really important question. Like he might be starting to connect the dots a little bit here. And he looks at his dad and he's like, Dad, we got the wood, we got the fire, but where's the lamb? Which, to be honest, is a great question. Because this was any other normal sacrifice, the only thing you would bring is the lamb. You didn't need the other two things. You wanna know why? Because where he's going has wood. He can make fire when he gets there. You can make an argument that it made the journey harder for Abraham by taking the wood and the fire from the very beginning. But that's all they bring. The one thing that's missing is the lamb. And so Isaac looks at his dad and says, Dad, we got the wood, we got the fire. It's kind of weird. But where's the lamb? And how does Abraham respond to his son? He doesn't say, well, got some bad news. You're the lamb, right? Happy Father's Day. What does he say? He says, the Lord will provide. Abraham in this moment doesn't know that God's going to provide a lamb. He doesn't know that at all. He's ready to proceed with what God's called him to go do. In fact, the author of Hebrews points out something really remarkable about Abraham's faith in this moment. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He believed that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham in this moment is ready to sacrifice his own son. And at the same time, he has so much faith that even if his son did die on the altar that day, even if he was consumed with fire, even if he was turned into ash, that God had the power to raise him back from the dead. Abraham's never seen a resurrection, never heard of a resurrection, and yet still in this moment believes somehow, some way, God's gonna keep his promises. I know what God's commanded me. I know what he told me. I'm gonna follow in obedience. I don't know how he's gonna keep his promises, but I know that he will. And he has so much faith in this moment that somehow, some way, God's gonna keep his promise. And he looks at his son with that kind of faith. He says, don't worry, God will provide. And what we see next is we see God providing. Look at how the story ends, verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. As it is said today, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Abraham and Isaac get to the top of the mountain. Abraham builds the altar, puts Isaac on top of the altar, bound, grabs his knife, is about to kill his own son. And in that moment, God speaks down from heaven and says, Abraham, stop what you're doing. And in this moment, God tells Abraham, look, you've passed the test. It's evident now. Now everyone can see. Abraham knows, Isaac knows, all of heaven knows, everyone who reads this story knows that what Abraham treasured and valued more than anything in this moment was not the gift that God gave him, but God himself, made abundantly clear in this moment. And God tells him, stop what you're doing, put down the knife. And what I can only imagine is that Abraham in this moment let out the greatest sigh of relief in all of human history. And lifted up his eyes and looked behind him, and caught in the thicket was the ram and the lamb that God provided for him. And Abraham in this moment joyfully takes his son off the altar and takes the lamb that God provides and places it on the altar. And with a triumph of praise, Abraham renames the place. And he calls it what? The Lord will provide. See, here's what's amazing about that place, Moriah. It's only mentioned one other time in the Old Testament. Book of 2 Chronicles. And it's located as the spot in which Solomon builds the temple. Temple was the place where God would dwell with his people, where the people of God would meet with God. And as we see Solomon build the temple in Moriah, it's really interesting that he calls it the land of Moriah, because at that point in time, it goes by a completely different name. You know what it is? Jerusalem. And thousands of years later, there is another son that will ascend a hill in Jerusalem and will be led to his death. And that other son is the Son of God. That is Jesus, who's come down to live among us and to dwell with us, to put on human flesh. And just like Isaac, Jesus will ascend another hill in Jerusalem. Just like Isaac, he will be led to this place by his own father. Just like Isaac, he will carry the wood in which he will be sacrificed on up the hill. But very much unlike Isaac, when Jesus is sacrificed on the cross, there's no substitute. When Jesus is on the cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The Father doesn't take him down. Because in that moment, the reason why there's no substitute for Jesus is because Jesus becomes the substitute for us. That cross, that's your cross. It's my cross. It's the cross that we deserve because of our own sin. The Bible's abundantly clear. The wages of our sin is death. The cross that Jesus takes is not his own. It belongs to us. It's our cross. But what God does is he provides a substitute for you and for me. And his name is Jesus, and he dies in our place. And just like Abraham, we too can gladly declare, the Lord has provided. And because the Lord has provided, just like Isaac, we can live. And the way that we live is by faith in what Christ has done for you and for me. God does not spare his son to provide a substitute. His son becomes the substitute for us. And by grace through faith in what Christ has accomplished and secured on the cross for you and for me, we, just like Isaac, can live, have life with him. And the way we enter in is by faith. What is faith? It's believing that Jesus is who he says that he is. And at the same time, it is valuing Christ above everything else in our hearts. It is knowing him rightly and loving him supremely. That's what it means to put your faith in Jesus. And so here's the big question we come back to yet again this morning for every single one of us. And the first question is this: what are you putting your faith in? What are you trusting that's not God? What's the center of your loves? What is the thing that you treasure more than anything? What's sitting on the throne of your heart as the king of your life? Every single one of us has something, a good something that is fighting for that position. And so what is it? And then here's the second thing. What God is inviting you and me to do today is to bring it to God and surrender it before him, to lay it down. Doesn't mean we don't stop loving those things. You should love your family. Dads, you should love your kids. But what it means is that we order our loves appropriately and we love him above all things. And here's the thing, for some of us today, there's some sin in our life that we need to take the knife out and we need to kill. We just need to get rid of it in our life. And there's others of us that we have a really good thing sitting on the throne of our hearts, but we got to dethrone it. And we got to put God there. We got to come to the altar and lay them down and trust in him that no matter what, he is good and he's faithful. That's how we live by faith. That is how we endure to the end. And so what is it? What is a thing in your life that God is calling you to right now to lay it down before him? I want to invite you to come and lay it down. Let me pray.